Oh, okay, we're recording now. So, Anne, I'll turn it over to you to introduce Beth.
Thank you so much, Larry, and welcome everyone here. It's great to see everyone. 2021 marks the regeneration of the Immigration Task Force now that we are in a new political era. So this is the second of our meetings, and we'll have another one next month to really begin brainstorming about how we want to move forward in 2021. But talking about Maribel is such an acute and wonderful and really educational, heart educational and brain educational way of re-beginning our work, because Maribel, as a person who is fleeing violence, seeking a better life, and seeking asylum in the US system, is a really poignant microcosm of the experience of immigrants who have sought a legal and documented way to be in our country, but are still encountering extraordinary challenges being here, challenges that we individually and as a group are really called to step forward to join hands and help with and create a support network for. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Maribel's sponsor, Beth Earths. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. Anne and I have developed a really great relationship over the last couple of years. She's been a godsend to me, as well as other people who are on the call. In fact, most of you have all in some way or another helped Maribel. And most of you, I think I looked who was here, have met her over the course of the last 2 years. So I want to just give you a little sense about, oh, Larry, now I'm stuck. Why won't my slide move forward?
Let's see.
There we go. I
You
want
got
to
it now?
start.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
I want to start with a really quick video. I just should have stayed there. This is from the Ford Foundation. I found it after I watched the Ford, the 60 Minutes. I think it was last week or the week before, maybe some of you watched it, and thought that they probably were doing some things on immigration, and surely they are. And the story of this woman that they have a video of on their website is not very different from Maribel's. So let's see, Larry, will you let me know if this isn't playing well?
I'll interrupt if it's not.
Es el gran sufrimiento que estamos pasando los inmigrantes a causa de las separaciones familiares. Por eso estoy aquí, para hablar con los 11 millones de indocumentados.
Beth, we can't see it.
Oh, you can't?
It's still on your slide deck. Like the screen is on your slide deck, not on the video.
Yeah, you have to go full screen. We can hear it though.
Y he estado luchando por 3 años contra esta orden de deportación. Mi hija es tan pegada a mí.
How's that?
Ella quedaría
There we go.
con 2 hermanos varones.
I'll start it over.
Okay.
And I would suggest making it full screen so that we can see it better too.
I will. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Can you see that? Laura? Larry?
Yes, we got it.
Es el gran sufrimiento que estamos pasando los inmigrantes a causa de las separaciones familiares. Por eso estoy aquí, para hablar con los 11 millones de indocumentados que habemos en este país. Y vine a este país y en busca de un futuro mejor para mis hijos. Y he estado luchando por 3 años contra esta orden de deportación. Mi hija es tan pegada a mí. Ella quedaría aquí junto con 2 hermanos varones. Y eso me aterra tanto. Y creo que me la merezco porque todos merecemos estar con nuestros hijos. Por eso estoy aquí, para pedir oren por favor por un cambio.
Señor y Padre nuestro, tú nos conoces y nos amas. María la Madre fue migrante, Jesús también fue migrante.
Y como todos los inmigrantes que venimos a trabajar, yo me siento muy orgullosa por tener la oportunidad de aportar a esta nación. Hacer lo que nuestros trabajos, queremos ser vistos como personas con valor. Queremos dignidad para nosotros, estamos buscando justicia, estamos buscando una igualdad para todos.
Okay, now can you see the PowerPoint again?
Yep.
Yes.
Thank you, Laura. Okay, so I thought that was an interesting video to share. Of course, that woman is facing deportation, and Maribel probably isn't, at least not now under the Biden administration policy. I just love this picture. It kind of speaks to the early story of Maribel as she came out of detention. On the evening that Chris and I picked Maribel up at the detention center in Aurora, the GEO facility, we took her to a Mexican restaurant, fairly authentic restaurant in downtown Old Aurora called La Cueva. It's a great place and it has very authentic Mexican food. Maribel ordered carne asada, which she told me months before she was planning to eat when she came out of detention, and a Coca-Cola, which is still her favorite drink, although we finally convinced her to drink Diet Coke. And I wish you can see her Coca-Cola there on the table. She's got her hair on top of her head, and I think that this speaks to some happiness that is going on. This was on May 30th, 2019. I'll probably always remember that date because we had waited for months for Maribel to come out of detention. And most of you know that she'd been there for 9 months. She came to the United States 9 months before crossing the border at Tijuana, and was then transported after an allegation of fear interview to a place in Arizona for maybe a week. And then by plane, and she was transported to Denver with a number of other immigrants and stayed there. And actually, while she was in detention, she was facing deportation at one point because they didn't believe her credible fear allegation. And her lawyer, who's been, Laura Shoup, who's been to our immigration task force meeting in the past, was able to step in and get a new assigned immigration judge at the detention center who got her another credible fear allegation, which she does have a credible fear. And eventually they were able to release her. She was released with a requirement for ICE check-ins, which we thought might go on for a long time, but there were only 2 months. She went once a month starting in July and checked in again, I believe, in August. And then they released her. This was after she saw the judge at the Federal Immigration Court in Denver to set her final immigration trial in October of 2021. Maribel came here leaving 4 children, her 4 children, and her mother behind in Mexico. And this is where she came from, this area on the slide in Guerrero, Mexico. Her pueblo, called Montecillos, is southeast of Acapulco. She had worked in Acapulco for a while before she came to the States. And her mother and her 4 children are still living there. Her release in May of 2019 was the second time Maribel had been released by the United States, and she was deported the first time. She had jumped the fence. And I think that was a really bad experience for her. She went home, saved a lot of money, paid a coyote and a caravan by bus to cross the border legally at Tijuana in September of 18. She feared for her life and the life of her children. She had had 2 husbands. I don't think they were legally married from what I can tell. She was abused by one of her husbands terribly. And he locked her in a room for 2 weeks and didn't let her out, and did some fairly horrific things to her. And this husband was part of the cartel. He's now in prison in Acapulco. I put American Dirt by Janine Cummings in here only because recently my daughter Ashley told me that this novel is totally about a woman, Lydia, who has a similar story to Maribel, living in Guerrero, Mexico. So if you want to read something that's similar, I did take a look at the summary on Amazon recently. Maribel, when she left Mexico, had no work, and she was caring for her 4 children. She had had a food stand in this village, Montesinos, or Pueblo, as she calls it. And the food stand, I understood in detention, was a restaurant. You know, my American white brain went to what I'm accustomed to, but it wasn't a restaurant at all. It was a small table, like maybe a little larger than a bedside table you would have in your home. And she was able to provide 40 meals an evening for people who would come by her food stand and buy them. Maribel is a fabulous cook. It's one of her strongest assets. And she makes really good food and has great sanitation. But imagine in making that food, it was on an open fire in a kitchen that was outside of her home in the Pueblo. She lived in a house with these 4 children and her mother that had a tin roof and some flooring, not a lot of furniture, and no electrical appliances, and no bathroom inside the home. So all of those kinds of living arrangements were so much different than her coming to our home when she was released from detention. You might be asking yourself about Maribel's children, and I don't know that I've shared these pictures before, but while Maribel was in detention, she pleaded with me a few times. Laura, this might have been a time Laura went to detention with me and did some translation, as well as a friend of mine named Freddie. And sometimes someone who was visiting also would take the phone and translate for me. My Spanish was really bad when I first started visiting. And so was Maribel's English, although her English was probably better than my Spanish. These are her 4 children and her mother. The young man is Jonathan, and he's in his soccer uniform. The children all play soccer. They go to it looks like to be a Catholic school to me, from the pictures that I've seen and the videos that she shared with me. The next picture here is her mother, Julieta, who has diabetes, and often one of the requests Maribel has is to send money to her mother to buy her insulin. And that frequently is something that we talk about. The next daughter is Maria Astaire. Took me a long time to get these right. Maria Astaire is the oldest. Today she's about 16. So she was about 14 when her mother got out of detention. And she plays soccer, and I understand she's a fabulous player. At one point when Maribel first was released from detention, Maria Astaire wanted to go to Acapulco with a team to play what sounds like very advanced soccer that you would see kids playing in today. And Maribel didn't want her to go to Acapulco. It's not a safe place was part of the reason. And she's a young girl, and we talked about it and who she was going with. Maribel finally let her go, and she was okay with her team. And it's her and Jonathan that I talk to most often if I'm communicating with them, or did when Maribel was living with us. And then this next daughter is Angelis. Of these 3 children, she's the youngest, and these 3 are all from the first husband that Maribel had. And Angelis now would probably be 13. This is a 2-year-old picture, and I saw one just recently, and she really has matured. And then this young man at the bottom here is Yael. And when Maribel came out of detention, Yael was 6. He's the same age as my granddaughter, Lena. And so she left all 4 of these children behind. I think Maribel believes that by now these children would be here, that she would have been able to immigrate here, get a work permit, a green card, and be able to bring her children here, but that hasn't happened. And so her goal in life is to provide a way to support her children, whether they're in Mexico or the United States, and take care of her mother. And none of them really have any means to work. Since Maribel has been in the United States, the cartel, who kicked over her food stand before she left, which is part of the reason that she fled her pueblo and left her children, was that she had no means to make any money any longer. The cartel insisted on rent for the food stand, which if you read American Dirt, you'll learn this cartel is so dangerous in this part of Mexico. And she left thinking that she'd be able to provide support for them and eventually bring them here. And I'll go on, that hasn't really happened. And so the cartel has now approached the oldest son about selling drugs for them. And if they weren't going to sell drugs, if he wasn't going to sell drugs, then it was required that somehow they pay the cartel rent for just being. So this is a tough story to take in. And you could see the woman in the video very much like Maribel crying. And, you know, she worries constantly about what's happening for these children and if they have enough food to eat and clothing to wear and the ability to even walk to school safely in the Pueblo. And this was a story I didn't really understand completely when we agreed to sponsor Maribel. I didn't understand for quite a while. There were 4 children. I might have understood that at some point when she was coming out of detention. As you know, there was permission for her lawyer to share details with me. What I also knew was that Maribel had a brother. I thought just one brother here in the US living in what I thought was Colorado Springs. It turns out that it was Glenwood Springs. And so we've since met the brothers. And that is where Maribel is living now. But these are precious children, just like our precious children in the United States. I would tell you that an aside is that at some point when we really felt they were in danger, we found a shelter for Maribel and her mother to go to, and eventually trying to get them here to the United States because they would have been in a shelter. There could have been an emergency order from a judge, but Maribel's mother did not want to leave the Pueblo. She's probably 60-ish, and she's lived there her entire life, was not interested in leaving the Pueblo and didn't want the children to go. It was a huge struggle for all of us. So we can take questions a little bit about the children as we finish up here. So soon after Maribel arrived, I realized that her brothers were in Glenwood Springs, and it's one of Chris's, my husband's, favorite places to go. So we eventually, in a couple weeks, we had invited Maribel's brothers. Here's another big American mistake, my American mistake, I'll take credit for. Inviting them to our home, which I soon realized was not going to happen. They were in fear of still traveling from Glenwood Springs to Denver, that something might happen to a vehicle, they might get stopped by the police. And Maribel's brothers are undocumented. They're part of that 11 million people that you heard in the video are undocumented. Now, Maribel is considered documented. And I would just quickly differentiate between a person immigrating here, seeking asylum, which Maribel is, and she does have a card when she was released from detention that she's seeking asylum. That card could actually allow her to travel and get through security at the Denver airport. She hasn't tried to do that, but she could. Freddie and Mauricio, her brothers, would not be able to do that legally. And so let's see. We went to Glenwood Springs, and I knew that, or assumed that all of Maribel's family there was undocumented. And it was an interesting weekend. Chris and I stayed at Hotel Denver, and we did have a chance to get into the pool. Maribel visited with her family. They went to a Mexican restaurant to eat that they enjoyed. She met a nephew that had been born, Damien, while she was, I believe, in detention, and was able to reunite with two brothers, Freddie and Mauricio. She has two other brothers living here, one in Oregon and one outside of Los Angeles in Orange County, and they all are undocumented. A couple of them have been here, immigrated here, or tried to immigrate here, got across the border, got through their fear allegation interview. I believe that might have been even way back in Bill Clinton's administration. They've been here a long time. And so they have been able to live under the radar in that group of 11 million people. We probably later that day met at least 100 other undocumented immigrants living in Glenwood Springs. Chris and I had no idea. We were invited to a christening party where Mauricio had been the godfather, and went to that party that evening, and probably there were 100 people, mostly from Maribel's pueblo in Mexico. They were all from Montesinos. Maribel must have called every one of them a cousin, and that may be true that they were cousins. I'm not really sure. And it was an enlightening experience. I know I shared it with Anne as soon as I returned from Glenwood Springs, realizing that my eyes had been opened, and I didn't really realize how many undocumented immigrants were living in the United States, and just in Glenwood Springs alone. I've since then learned so much. Glenwood Springs has unbelievable services for immigrants, and probably far more accessible for Maribel and her brothers and their families than here in Denver, Colorado. So I started to learn that this was a good place for her. And she met a man named Luis, who many of you have heard about, who was from her village. Her parents knew Maribel's parents, and they had played together as children and gone to school together. And they started to develop a relationship. And eventually, in the late fall of 19 and early winter, Maribel wanted to be in Glenwood Springs more than in Denver, which was fine with us. She's an adult, free to make her own decisions. Our role as her sponsors were to get her out of detention and hopefully get her out on her own. And in the meantime, we'd hired an attorney here in Denver to represent her. She'd been at the hearing in August to set Maribel's final trial date for late this year, 2021. And so she knew that Maribel was going back and forth. And during that time, she filed a work permit for Maribel. And that was in late September, early October of 19. And in January of 2020, right before COVID started, Maribel's work permit with Homeland Security was denied. This was still during the Trump administration, and there were policies that were changing pretty frequently. Lawyers told us that they were very hard to keep up with. And they had moved the requirement from, I think it was 90 days to 365 days that an immigrant had to be in the United States before they could file for a work permit. And so this really messed up Maribel's application, which was denied. In the meantime, COVID started. The attorney tried to figure out how she could appeal. And in the midst of all of that, she closed her practice in Denver because of COVID and, unable to continue to do the representation that she needed to. Maribel and Luis continued to have a relationship And sometime in February or March of 20, in the midst of COVID, we understood that Maribel was pregnant. And by this time, she was living in Glenwood Springs. We talked about what her choices and options were, but you had to grow an appreciation for her culture and the Catholic Church's influence on people from Mexico. And so carrying the pregnancy and having a baby in Maribel's eyes was her only choice. And she was able to seek prenatal care in Glenwood Springs at the hospital there that seemed to be quite good. She had a nurse practitioner and following her. And so I started to learn a little bit about the demographics of Glenwood Springs. And they've had this huge population growth. The Latino population there is 27% of the overall population, and 70% of those people are Mexican. So it started to make sense to me that all these people from Maribel's Pueblo were living in Glenwood Springs, and how comfortable that felt for her. It concerned me and worried me that she wasn't enculturating into the culture of the United States and what that meant for her future. But I felt like that certainly wasn't our place to try to get into the middle of. It was a big struggle to let go. She continued to say to me many times, I don't know, Elizabeth, should I be in Denver or Glenwood Springs? Me no, me not know. And it was very hard for me to advise her. I would have advised my own daughter differently than the choices that Maribel was making. But there were so many people from her Pueblo, so many things that felt comfortable to her. The people, the food, the culture, the visiting, the language, that was so much different than us. And her brothers and Luis were there. I think she struggled significantly with her relationship with Luis. You can see her here. These are while she's in Denver. These are beautiful pictures of her, I think. One is on the train. Laura, you'd appreciate this because we talked so often about helping her figure out public transportation. And by the time we bought a second light rail ticket, she had it. She's got her cell phone and her earphones, her headphones in, and she looks like she's been here a while. She's got a purse strapped over her shoulder and clothing on that looks very Americanized. And you can see her in the other picture in our kitchen making salsa, which many of you made donations to. She makes this absolutely wonderful salsa, and she made 3 types. There was a very mild type called Rojas. There was a kind of medium salsa called Montecillos after her Pueblo. And then there was a very hot habanero salsa that some of you might have tried. My family loved it, called, oh gosh, I just lost it, Especial. So she really loved making any kind of food, but here she's canned up salsa that a lot of people on the immigration task force were lucky enough to have. And I think these were some of the happier moments at our house. She'd never cooked in an oven before when she came. And my little granddaughter, Lena, taught her how to make cakes and brownies because the oven was new for her, but she loved those kind of baked goods. We made tres leches cake, which she'd never had before, which we make at our house pretty often before Maribel came. But she said it was just sold in the tourist areas of the country. So, there were lots of things to learn. Most everything she made could be left out on the counter. She would ice up meat in her Pueblo, maybe in an ice chest without a refrigerator. And everything else was left out on the counter until you used it. So they went grocery shopping pretty often for fresh produce to make almost always every day some kind of taco or dish that you could cook on an open fire. This was a picture of Maribel and baby Luis. They're here in Denver. I could tell you lots of stories about Maribel coming to Denver after she went to Glenwood Springs. Some of them are, one is an embarrassing story for me about Luis trying to buy a car here at a dealership on Broadway that really did them wrong, that I got very bothered with the dealership about. I felt like they were really cheating Maribel and Luis. And, but it was a very emotional moment for me to see that we would treat people that way in our country. We were having lunch that day in a restaurant not too far from that dealership, and Maribel and the baby went home. This was the second time I'd seen the baby. We'd seen the baby here, and then we went to Glenwood Springs. Maribel and Luis came back with the baby. These were all times when the COVID virus was kind of on the downtrend. And then we've been there again recently in the last few weeks to see them. He's such a sweet little thing. And this is him just a couple weeks ago. Maribel is just a great mother. I watched her when I was there a few weeks ago taking care of him. I think it's important for you to know that, and I think this is part of the culture, Maribel and Luis, the father, are no longer together. He's cut and left. Doesn't respond to my phone calls, her phone calls. He's left Maribel in an apartment that he has a lease for. Thank goodness she's not signed on to the lease. And she has this wonderful landlord. Pray for him. His name is Ryan White. He lives in Oregon. I talk to him quite frequently, and he's figured out to let Maribel stay there recently and to have her own lease, which eventually will help her get a driver's license. You have to have some record that you have a location in which you live with a US address or a Colorado address in order to get a driver's license. Baby Luis and Maribel are currently in Glenwood Springs. She's still waiting for an asylum hearing, which now has been postponed to February of 2024. So now, yeah, Laura, 3 more years. It's just unbelievable that it's taking that long, but it's because of COVID. The immigration courts in Denver and across the country aren't open. And so she has to wait. Recently, before Chris and I went there, we had a Zoom call with a lawyer, with Maribel. We don't do any of these things without Maribel. She's an adult and makes her own decisions and has her own autonomy, which, you know, sometimes I don't always agree with the choices, but that is what happens with someone you're trying to help immigrate here. She's disappointed that it's going to take so long. And now, you know, she was seeking asylum and could become a permanent resident, a work permit would become much easier for her. So we've since met with an attorney. Her name's Jennifer Smith. She has offices in Glenwood Springs. And there are many, many lawyers who represent clients for immigration and asylum seeking in Glenwood Springs. The Denver immigration attorneys and Senator Bennett's office tell me that they're way more expensive than Denver attorneys. But I have been unable in the last few months to find anyone who's willing to talk about seeking asylum cases and taking them that are in the metropolitan Denver area. They're interested in helping people get passports and go to the consulate and file for a work permit, but not interested in representing an asylum case. Jennifer Smith in Glenwood Springs is, and she's a very highly competent lawyer that we were able to find, but we have not engaged her at this point for a few reasons. Legal services are really expensive, and there's a court date that's still 3 years out, and she wants $5,000 upfront money in order to take Maribel's case, and tells Chris and I that it's likely going to be somewhere between $10,000 and $20,000 to represent Maribel in court. Now, it could be a lot less than that if she has a lot of, you know, support. Maribel has a huge file. She keeps everything that she has gotten from detention, and her court and Homeland Security. They send her mail. She has made a change of address with Homeland Security for her address in Glenwood Springs. Interestingly enough, when Chris and I were there, they wouldn't deliver any mail to the address because she needed to go in and document that she was living there and make sure that her name was on the box at the house where she was living, which I think she was afraid to do. So we did all of that while she was there, and lo and behold, she filed all by herself for baby Luis's Social Security card, and it came in the mail last week. She called me on the phone with that Social Security certificate in her hand and was just elated. She had the baby in her arms that he had a United States of America Social Security card, and he is a US citizen. He could get a passport. And so that's one thing that's been really joyful for Maribel. So I think I've talked to you about all of this. She spent 9 months in detention. She was in the GEO facility.
Oh, okay, great.
When she was released, she went before the federal court in August of 19. They set a trial date, but now that's been reset. She's applied for a work permit and her past lawyer withdrew. It was interesting talking to the lawyer in Glenwood Springs, Jennifer Smith, because she knew Maribel's lawyer here, Christine Swenson, and spoke very highly of her and knew that she'd closed her practice. That kind of gave me a little bit of solace because I really liked the lawyer here. I felt like she was going to do her very best to represent Maribel. So it's very disappointing that we need to find new legal counsel. So Maribel's, the one story I still want to share with you before I move on to legislation is that when Chris and I were in Glenwood Springs in the last few weeks, we were there on a Sunday evening and we went to Maribel's house where we've been before, and her brothers came, her 2 brothers, and one of them is married with a son, Maciel, who is 7 years old, a little guy I just think is a blast. He would love my grandchildren and he plays with the same stuff that Wyatt does. So I had a really nice time with him. But here we are in Maribel's apartment, and I just have to kind of set the stage for you. She lives in an old house just about 2 blocks from Hotel Denver and the train station in Glenwood Springs, right on the river. And you can walk from the hotel to her house east. And it's a 2-story home, not unlike a home that we might find and live here somewhere in Denver. But there's 4 apartments in the home that have been refurbished so that, the landlord, Ryan, can rent out 4 different apartments. And Maribel has a 1st floor apartment, and you walk into what is a living room, dining room, and bedroom. That's the main room, and it's all open. And it's not large. There's a small closet in that room. And then behind that is what probably was the original kitchen in the house, small. And there's a refrigerator plugged into a back corridor wall. There's a small stove, and there is a bathroom. I do think this is living quarters that far exceed what Maribel lived in Mexico, but certainly aren't what I'm used to living in. And I don't know, I think I live a pretty middle-class American life. Not that I necessarily have that expectation for Maribel now, but I hope that she gets to live in a place like that, someplace different than that at some point in her life. Anyway, so Sunday night, her brothers come and we get out lawn chairs and we're on the bed and the children are there and we're having a conversation. Our whole purpose in going to Glenwood Springs, our purpose, not Maribel's, was to see how we could raise money for legal fees, because we had met with this lawyer, Jennifer Smith, and wanted to raise fees. And I went over there for 2 reasons: to find out how she thought she could help and her family could help, and how much they might be able to give to legal fees, and how she might raise some money knowing that she's not working. And we were never really able to talk about that because she has too many other things going on. She wants a driver's license, and she wants to work, although she doesn't have a work permit. And she wanted a social security card. She wanted to be able to change her address and get things delivered to her house. She needed to make psychology appointments and pick up medications that she was on at the pharmacy and see her physician. And it just goes on and on and on. So the goals that Chris and I had for going over there, that Ann and Laura and I had discussed on a call, were never going to happen. I knew that. I finally came to that decision on Sunday night, but here we are, 8 of us sitting in this little 1-bedroom apartment in the middle of what's the bedroom, with the baby and my CL, having a family meeting about Maribel's future. And I went back to the hotel that night and I said to Chris, this reminded me so much of the work I used to do in the Dominican Republic with Partners in Mission from our church. We used to go there on an annual basis, and we'd spend somewhere from 2 to 3 weeks down there. Some of you know of this, some of you may have been on one of these trips. And I felt like I was in one of those pueblos down there, and I was sitting in a home down there, and I felt like in the middle of the United States of America, in the state of Colorado, I was in a third world country. It was just so hard for me to imagine. But Maribel was happy. She was happy, and this is where she wanted to be. And so our goal became her goals, of course. And she was pretty upset about what was going to happen with the apartment and if she was going to have to move. And I'd already been in touch with Ryan and had numerous conversations about how we could keep Maribel in that apartment. I hadn't discussed with him yet that there was no way he could evict her at this point. Unfortunately, President Biden has extended the executive orders for not evicting people through June 30. So I think she's safe, but she doesn't understand that, really. She doesn't realize that if he posts an eviction notice, he probably can't evict her. And he's told me he was going to, but he never did it. And so, you know, I think some higher power probably helped Ryan come to his senses about what to do with Maribel. And the baby, I think he doesn't want to see a woman and a young baby without shelter and a place to live. So I want to talk a little bit about the Us Citizenship Act. Many of you've probably read about it, but it is a pathway to citizenship that would affect Maribel. Maribel's sister-in-law, Laritza, who's married to Freddie, is a dreamer, so it would affect her. Maribel's 2 brothers, 4 brothers really, but the 2 in Glenwood Springs who are undocumented would also be able to have a path to citizenship in this bill. So a lot of those people I met at the christening party and these other 11 million people in the United States would have a pathway to citizenship. It keeps families together. The woman who's worried about being deported that you saw in the video, I think there are so many of those living across the country and in the state of Colorado. It promotes immigration and refugee. I started to talk about that, lost track of it. So an asylum seeker is what Maribel is. A refugee is someone, now we've seen a lot about that on the news in the last several days. A refugee is someone who is vetted and doesn't get to come to the United States, sometimes for months or years. And they would also hopefully be able to have more refugees enter the United States. I'm not sure today why President Biden is stepping back what he already talked about with refugees coming here, because they're a pretty safe bet usually. They're going to assimilate into the United States and take up a profession. And then there's a third category. I've lost track of what it is. Laura, do you remember?
Probably just undocumented.
Oh, undocumented. Yeah, and we've already talked about those. Hopefully this act would also change what's going on at the border. I know that that is such a confusing issue for Americans to look at that. And for some American, it's not confusing at all. It's like, why in the world are we doing this? And to address the root cause of migration. Migrant farm workers we've talked about for many years in our country. So I think this is an important bill, whether it, all of these components are really part of a final bill, we won't know. But I do think this is a reason for all of us to be in touch with our congressional representatives to talk about the support of this bill. I doubt that that's a problem for most of us in Colorado and in the districts that we live in. But I do think they need to hear from us that this is an important issue. And certainly we would be helping the life of many people that we know or have had experiences with in our communities. There's also a lot of legislation going on in the state of Colorado right now in this session, which will end sometime in May. We have really short legislative sessions in the state of Colorado that start in January and end in May usually. They have already sent the Immigration Legal Defense Fund, House Bill 1194, to appropriations. So this bill could really help Maribel provide some legal defense funds for her. I would like to share with you that I've probably been in touch with, 20, 25, 30 different organizations about pro bono legal fees or some reduced legal fees for Maribel without much to find out there. I have spoken personally with the immigration liaison. Thank you, Anne, for that contact at Senator Bennett's office, Priscilla, and she's been really helpful, but all of those have been a dead end, which I really already spoke about. It does look like creating the Colorado Office of New Americans is going to pass. And a lot of immigration bills in the last 2 years have been deferred and never picked up again in future legislation. So these are things to keep your eye on and talk to your own representative in your district in the metropolitan area about supporting these bills and how important immigration is to you and could be. I love this picture. Maribel was helping us fix Thanksgiving dinner for the parish a couple of years ago before COVID, and she got a big kick out of that. I think because she was probably the youngest person there and had the most energy. And she's with Warren Ben here. The Bens have been a huge support, as well as the Kleinkoffs and a lot of other people to us about Maribel. Tricia Springer taught her English, and people in our church have done so much, and it hasn't just been money. It's just been giving Maribel support and being her friend and seeing her for the person that she is. In her immigration, this is what's on her plate. I do have hope that she won't get deported. I don't know what the hope is for her children to come here. I've already told you these are the other needs that she has, and I hope that you would write your legislators. What she needs in Glenwood Springs still is food, childcare, shelter, childcare when she's working, shelter, money for rent, transportation, clothing. She is getting psychological support, and Anne and I are both absolutely amazed that she's on Medicaid. We do believe that happened because of the baby, which we really didn't think was going to happen. And she is getting support from WIC, Women, Infants, and the federal program for formula and diapers. Little asides, things like she goes to the grocery store to use her WIC card, and they're out of the formula that she uses. So she can usually only pick up formula once a month. So we send her formula, and things are arriving through Amazon. Her English lessons closed in Glenwood Springs during COVID, and she really was doing well. She was going to an ESL program, and that closed, and I hope she'll get back to that. If she gets this lease accomplished with this landlord, she'll end up having documentation for the ability to get a driver's license. She thinks she can just drive without any kind of lessons, but Chris kind of doubts that. And of course, then there's the issue about a car and registration and insurance and, you know, everything that we do and we know about. This was a picture at a family birthday celebration. If you don't know them, this is my daughter, Amanda and Lena. Yes, she is kind of a mini me. The children love Maribel. And fortunately, my two daughters are very well developed in speaking Spanish. And Maribel taught the children a lot of Spanish. So there were a lot of asides that were great lessons for us. They miss Maribel. They ask me about her every day. So Maribel and other immigrants in our country need this dignity, justice, and equality. And they need work so that their children can eat. And we know that there's work for them in the United States. What can you do to help? You can give money. And so many of you on the Zoom education today have done that. And it's so appreciated. Anne suggested to me recently that you send checks to me, made out to First Plymouth. I would then give them back to the church for deposit. They would send a check to Maribel, but then there is a mechanism for me to keep track of how much money in the Immigration Task Force is really sitting there designated specifically for Maribel. You can do advocacy work here in Colorado and in Congress. You could send mail, cards, gift cards to Maribel at this address. It works. We're so happy about that. You could send diapers, wipes, and formula through Amazon. I could help you with that if you want to give me a call about what exactly to do. I do want to say that there's been a donor anonymously recently who donated their stimulus check to Maribel. And Maribel and Chris and I couldn't be more grateful. It's gone to her rent. And we're very, very appreciative that that's been able to happen. So that's just an example about what people at First Plymouth have been able to do to support Maribel. I do believe that with some initial coordination with and through me, that you could also help in a non-monetary way of coordinating appointments and transportation. Yes, you'd be on the phone coordinating those in Glenwood Springs with Maribel. Google Translate works really well to help with that. You could help her find places where there are food banks with food. That's been a real difficult situation during COVID because so many of the food banks had run out of food. We could coordinate with other churches. Gary Bryant, who used to be our interim minister at First Plymouth, has a church in Glenwood Springs where he's interim now. And maybe there's some possibility to coordinate there and through the Catholic Church. I do think with this lease, they'll pay 1 month's rent for Maribel through the Catholic Church, closed for baby Luis. I wanted to end with this. This is from a website called Colorado Immigrants Justice Funds, which I've also been in touch with. If you send me any information that might help Maribel, I'll be in touch. And we'll see if there's anything that we can do. But this young man, Selkie from Cameroon, said this: bright and shining, you never know how many people you might be a lighthouse for. You never know how many people find their way home, even in the wildest storms. So I could open it up for any questions if you want to unmute yourself. And I just can't say thank you enough for everything. So many of you in the Adult Education Forum today have done so much already. You're on the Immigration Task Force, and Maribel and Chris and I really appreciate it.